To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
In 2007, a 2-year-old little girl named Mariah Alvarez was rushed to a Texas hospital. She was unresponsive. Her tiny body was covered in bruises. Within hours, her mother was under arrest. That mother was Melissa Lucio. Police believed the bruises told a clear story: abuse. Prosecutors would later argue that Melissa had beaten her daughter to death. But Melissa told investigators something different. She said Mariah had fallen down a steep set of stairs 2 days earlier. And for nearly 7 hours, she denied hurting her child. Until she didn't. By the end of a long, late-night interrogation, exhausted and surrounded by investigators, Melissa said the words that would change everything. "I guess I did it." Those 4 words would send her to death row. But here's the question. Were they a confession, or were they the breaking point of a woman who had spent her entire life surviving abuse and finally told police what they wanted to hear? This is Forensic Tales, episode 322, the story of Melissa Lucio. Welcome to Forensic Tales. I'm your host, Courtney Fretwell. Each episode features real stories, highlighting how forensic science was used to uncover the truth, from fingerprinting to blood spatter, to criminal profiling and familial DNA. We explore every investigative angle. If you enjoy deep dives into real cases and the science behind them, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you want even more content, including bonus episodes and behind-the-scenes updates, you can join our community over on Patreon. The support there truly helps keep this show going. You can also find Forensic Tales on YouTube, where I am sharing episodes, clips, and additional content. So make sure to subscribe there as well. And one small favor that makes a huge difference for the show. If you're enjoying Forensic Tales, please consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps other true crime listeners discover the podcast. All right, let's get into today's case. A quick note before getting into the episode: we cover a lot of heavy topics, but the topics discussed in this episode are very sensitive, including child abuse, sexual abuse, and the death penalty. So please, take care while listening. A list of resources will be included at the end of the episode and in the show notes. It's no secret that some states execute more than others, and some states don't even allow people to be sentenced to death. The state of Texas has executed more people than any other state in the country. Since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, Texas alone has carried out over 500 executions. But here's something most people don't realize. Very few of those executions have been women. In fact, women make up less than 2% of death row inmates nationwide. And in Texas history, only a handful of women have ever been executed, which makes this case different. Because at one point, the state of Texas was preparing to execute a mother of 14. Her name is Melissa. But before her name was ever in the newspapers, before she was ever on death row, before she became synonymous with words like false confessions, she was a mom. And before we talk about the events that led her to death row, it's important to talk about what happened in Melissa's life, starting from her childhood. Because many people say how she was brought up and raised directly contributed to what happened to her daughter years later. Melissa was born in Lubbock, Texas on June 18, 1969, and raised in a small Texas community near the U.S.-Mexico border. But her childhood was anything but loving or stable. When she was just an infant, her biological father suddenly died. And from that moment forward, she suffered years of extreme abuse that began when she was just a child. When she was just 7 years old, she was mistreated by her mom's boyfriend for a period of about 2 years. And as is so often the case, trauma didn't end when childhood did. By the time Melissa turned 16, she had run away from home and got married. Even though she was legally too young to get married, her mom provided consent anyway, so she essentially became a child bride with her mother's blessing. As a teen bride, she married a man named Guadalupe. But just because she had another man in her life, that didn't mean the violence and abuse stopped. Melissa would later say that he was both physically and emotionally abusive toward her throughout their relationship. He was also addicted to drugs and alcohol. So you can only imagine the kind of life she lived with him. So by 16 years old, Melissa was married and pregnant. She and Guadalupe would end up having a total of 5 children together. But their marriage wouldn't last. He abandoned Melissa and the kids not long after their 5th child was born. Then came another man, a man named Robert Alvarez. He became Melissa's second husband. Together, they would have 7 children. Then while Melissa was incarcerated, she gave birth to 2 more children, a pair of twins. That brings us to 14 children by 2007. She had also suffered several miscarriages. Just like her first husband, her second was just as abusive. During their relationship, Robert beat Melissa, choked her, repeatedly assaulted her, and threatened to kill her. To be completely honest, Melissa's entire life was marked by poverty, unstable relationships, and documented domestic violence. Most of her partners were abusive, and police reports show repeated calls to her home. Her neighbors described chaos, and social services had been involved at various points. She spent her entire life at the center of abuse and violence. By 2007, Melissa was living in a small apartment in Harlingen, Texas, with many of her children, including her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah Alvarez, the girl at the center of this tragic story. Mariah was born in September 2004 and became Melissa's 12th child. She was also one of the 7 children Melissa had with Robert Alvarez. Mariah was described by family members as sweet, quiet, and small for her age. At just 2 years old, she was just a baby. She literally had her entire life ahead of her. But that precious young life was taken one day in 2007. And even after all of these years, there are still so many unanswered questions about what exactly happened. In early February of that year, the family had just moved into a new apartment. But there was a feature about the building that's important to understand. The stairway outside the unit was very steep and made of wood. It was the kind of staircase you had to be careful with. If you weren't paying attention or lost your footing, you could easily slip and fall. And, according to Melissa, that's exactly what happened to her daughter, Mariah. Melissa said that 2 days before her death, she accidentally fell down the building's back stairwell. Here's something else you should know about Mariah. Melissa said that her daughter had a mild physical disability that made her unstable when walking. She also said that she had fallen before, so what happened on this particular day wasn't a big deal. Melissa said Mariah cried, but seemed okay afterward. So there was never a hospital visit to get her checked out. There wasn't even a call to her pediatrician. Melissa was just a mother who thought her daughter would be fine. But on February 15th, 2007, everything changed. That evening, 2-year-old Mariah became unresponsive, and within hours, investigators would begin building a case, not around an accident, but around murder. On the evening of February 15th, 2007, paramedics were called to Melissa's apartment. And when they arrived, they found Mariah lying on the living room floor. She wasn't breathing. She had no pulse. According to emergency records, she was in full cardiac arrest. But here was the first red flag. No one was immediately beside her when responders entered the room. She was completely alone. The authorities would later learn that Mariah had gone down for a nap but never woke up. Paramedics began CPR immediately. They knew time wasn't on their side. If they wanted any chance at saving this 2-year-old little girl, they needed to act fast. But as they worked on her, something else stood out. Mariah's body was absolutely covered in bruises. Not just one or two, multiple bruises. Across her face, torso, arms, and legs. Some appeared fresh, others were older, days or even weeks old. Responders also observed what appeared to be a previously broken arm, one that had not recently been treated. There was also a mark on her back that investigators would later describe as a bite mark, and patches of hair that appeared to have been pulled from her scalp. It's those kinds of details that just make you sick to your stomach. As a mom myself, this was the hardest part of the episode to talk about. Despite aggressive resuscitation efforts at the apartment, Mariah never regained consciousness. She was rushed to the hospital, and in the emergency room, doctors continued life-saving measures, but nothing worked. At the hospital, Mariah Alvarez was pronounced dead. She was 2 years old, and almost immediately, the focus shifted from saving a life to determining how that life ended. The first step was the autopsy, and here's where things get extremely graphic, especially since we're talking about a 2-year-old little victim. But according to the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy, Mariah had suffered extensive abuse in her short time on Earth. In fact, the emergency room doctor who treated her would later testify at Melissa's trial that this was the worst case of child abuse he had seen in his entire 30-year medical career. Mariah's autopsy documented all of her external and internal injuries. Externally, the bruising was extensive. There was no doubt that this girl had been abused by someone, whether it was her mom or her dad or a combination or both. But the most important autopsy findings were found inside her skull. The medical examiner discovered evidence of blunt force trauma to the head. There was significant bleeding and swelling within the brain. Injuries consistent, in the pathologist's expert opinion, with forceful impact. Not a minor bump, not a simple tumble. The forensic pathologist would later testify that Mariah's injuries weren't consistent with a fall down a set of stairs like Melissa said. Instead, they were consistent with Mariah being beaten to death. So on paper, the official cause of death was ruled homicide, blunt force trauma to the head. This little girl had been beaten to death, according to the forensic evidence. And that conclusion would shape everything that followed. Because even before Mariah was officially pronounced dead at the hospital, investigators were already turning their attention to her mother. Within hours of paramedics arriving at the apartment, Melissa was taken to the police station for questioning. She had not slept. She had just lost her daughter, and she was pregnant with twins. What followed would become one of the most scrutinized interrogations in modern death penalty cases. Over the course of nearly 7 hours, Melissa was intensely interrogated by police, and throughout that entire time, she never once had an attorney present. So you can just picture the scene. She's pregnant. She just lost one of her daughters. And she's a woman in her 30s with a lifelong history of being abused and pressured by men. The interview began in the late evening hours of February 15th and stretched into the early morning hours of the 16th. And right away, detectives didn't play hard to get. They immediately confronted Melissa about the bruising found on Mariah's body. They looked her in the face and told her The injuries didn't look accidental. They also insisted they already knew what happened. But Melissa kept saying over and over that she didn't hurt her daughter. According to court records and later review of the interrogation footage, she verbally asserted her innocence a total of 86 times. And at least 35 times, she shook her head no. She stuck to her original story. She said Mariah had fallen down the stairs 2 days before, and that's probably where most of the bruises came from. She said she never hit her. She said she loved her daughter. But the questioning didn't stop. Investigators didn't believe her story about the fall. They told her the injuries were too severe. They told her accidents don't look like this. They told her they already knew she was responsible. And according to defense experts, it became clear that the interrogation wouldn't end until Melissa admitted to something. To put this situation into context, most interrogations last between 30 minutes and 2 hours, according to the Innocence Project. Research into false confessions has shown that the risk increases significantly during prolonged, high-pressure questioning, especially when a suspect is isolated, emotionally distressed, and repeatedly told that denial is not an option. Melissa's interrogation went on for nearly 7 hours. By that point, she was exhausted. She was crying, her voice was quiet, and after hours of pressure, she said the words that would later be played for a jury. I guess I did it. 4 words. Words that prosecutors would call a confession. Words that the defense would later argue were the product of coercion. And in a death penalty case, those words carried enormous weight. Throughout the rest of the interrogation, Melissa eventually admitted to biting and beating Mariah in the past, as well as pinching her genitals, but denied causing the fatal head injury. So I think that's an important place to stop and reflect. Melissa eventually admitted to abusing Mariah. There's no question about whether she should have been arrested for child abuse or not. In my opinion, she definitely should have. But the bigger question is whether or not she caused Mariah's death or not. Child abuse, yes. Murder, I don't know. But for investigators, they had everything they needed to move forward. Following this marathon of an interrogation, the state of Texas charged Melissa with capital murder. This meant that if she was convicted, she faced the death penalty. At trial, prosecutors relied heavily on one thing: her demeanor. Texas Ranger Victor Escalon, the investigator who conducted much of the interrogation, testified that he knew Melissa was guilty from the moment he laid eyes on her, based on how she looked. He told the jury that her slumped posture, her passivity, her failure to make eye contact told him right there and then that she did it. He read her body language as a confession before she ever said the words. And when she eventually said, "I guess I did it," the state argued that sealed it. But the defense had prepared experts who saw something very different. Psychologist Dr. Jonathan Pinkerman and social worker Norma Villanueva had reviewed thousands of pages of records, including protective services files documenting years of domestic violence and abuse. They interviewed Melissa, they administered psychological testing, they studied her history, and they reached a much different conclusion. They believed Melissa's posture, her bowed head, her flat expression, her eventual acquiescence weren't signs of guilt. They were actually signs of trauma. According to them, her behavior during the interrogation was consistent with someone who had endured a lifetime of abuse by men in positions of authority, someone conditioned to submit, someone who survived by agreeing. But the jury never heard that testimony. The trial court ruled that the defense experts couldn't testify to explain Melissa's demeanor or how trauma affects a woman under interrogation. So as a result, the jury was left with one interpretation: the Rangers. Without context, her silence looked like guilt. Her posture looked like an admission, and her exhausted words sounded like a confession. Next, the jury heard about all the details surrounding Mariah's injuries. This testimony came directly from the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy. He testified that Mariah had died from blunt force trauma to the head. He believed that her injuries weren't consistent with a fall, like Melissa said. She had been beaten to death by the hands of her own mother. To try to refute this evidence, Melissa's defense expert testified that yes, Mariah showed signs of physical abuse, but he believed her death could have been caused by a fall or being, quote, hit by a strong force. Melissa's attorney also drove that point home. Here's part of what he told the jury during closing arguments. Now, in the opening remarks that we made in the beginning of the trial, after you were all seated here, I told you my client is not up for Mother of the Year. I told you that my client is guilty of injury to a child. She is, and she has admitted that. The question here before you is whether or not on February 17th, 2007, Melissa intentionally and knowingly killed Mariah Alvarez. That's the issue. That's the issue. Not whether she beat her, not whether she broke her arm, not whether she's a lousy mother or didn't provide for her children. That's not an issue. Melissa's argument was that she wasn't responsible for Mariah's death, and she didn't directly cause it. She also said she falsely confessed during her police interview. She only said she did it after hours upon hours of questioning. She didn't have an attorney, she was tired, she was pregnant. She was in a room surrounded by white male police officers. She had been abused by men since she was 7 years old. She eventually just gave up and told them what she thought they wanted to hear. But it's the same question we've asked on so many previous episodes. Would you confess to a crime you didn't commit? I think a lot of us like to think we wouldn't do that, but it happens far more often than you'd expect. According to data from the National Registry of Exonerations, the two leading causes of wrongful convictions of women are false admissions made during police interrogation and faulty forensic evidence. If you ask Melissa and her supporters, they'll say this case has both. Approximately 40% of exonerated women were wrongly convicted of harming children or other loved ones in their care, and nearly 70% were wrongfully convicted of crimes that never took place at all, events that were accidents, deaths by suicide, and fabricated. According to Melissa's attorneys, that's what this case was about. So that's the question the jury was faced with. Were Mariah's injuries consistent with child abuse and a fall down the stairs? Or was her death caused by blunt force trauma to the head? Trauma sustained at the hands of her mother. The jury sided with the prosecution. They believed that the forensic evidence showed that Mariah had been beaten to death. Melissa was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in 2008. Robert Alvarez was convicted of endangering a child and sentenced to 4 years in prison. The jury never heard the full extent of her childhood sexual abuse, either during the trial or at her sentencing. They didn't hear the depth of the domestic violence she endured. They didn't hear how early trauma can shape a person's response to authority, fear, and confrontation. Despite the fact that Melissa had no prior violent criminal record, she was sentenced to die. As one federal appellate judge would later write, facts matter. In this morality play of citizen decisions of life or death, the jury did not hear her defense. I mentioned at the top of the episode that at the time of Melissa's arrest, she was pregnant with twins. So while she was in custody, the twins were put up for adoption, and Melissa was sent to death row at the Patrick O'Daniel unit in Gatesville, Texas. But that's not the end of Melissa's story, not even close. After she was sentenced to death, the appeals process began, and like many capital cases, it would stretch on for years. In 2019, a 3-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned her conviction. The panel ruled that the trial court had interfered with Melissa's constitutional right to present a defense, specifically by excluding expert testimony about how trauma can affect a woman's demeanor during interrogation. For a moment, it looked like she might get a new trial, but that's not what happened. The full Fifth Circuit later reheard the case en banc, meaning a larger group of judges reconsidered it, and they reversed the earlier ruling. In plain language, Melissa would remain on Texas death row, but questions about the forensic evidence kept popping up. At the request of her post-conviction attorneys, Dr. Thomas Young, a former chief medical examiner in Kansas City, reviewed the autopsy findings, and Dr. Young concluded that the original medical examiner may have reached the wrong conclusions. He questioned whether Mariah's injuries definitively ruled out an accidental fall, and he pointed to another case involving the same medical examiner, a man named Manuel Vilas, whose death sentence had later been overturned after further medical review contradicted the original findings. Support for Melissa began to spread like wildfire. In 2021, a group of legal scholars, trauma experts, and organizations that work with survivors of abuse filed an amicus brief in her case. They essentially argued that her subdued behavior and eventual acquiescence during interrogation were consistent with trauma, not guilt. They also emphasized that the jury had never been allowed to hear that explanation. Then, in January 2022, the stakes became very, very real. Cameron County officials signed an execution warrant. Melissa was scheduled to be executed on April 27, 2022. For the first time in years, there was a date. As soon as the pen hit the paper, Melissa's attorneys filed for clemency. Under Texas law, the Board of Pardons and Paroles would have to recommend clemency before the governor could intervene, and that's when something unusual started happening. 83 members of the Texas House of Representatives, Democrats and Republicans, signed a letter urging that her execution be halted. To be blunt, they called it a potential miscarriage of justice. Even one of the jurors who had sentenced her to death publicly expressed regret, saying he had felt pressured during deliberation and had changed his vote from life imprisonment to death. But Melissa's support wasn't just limited to the states. She had also gained international support. The Mexican ambassador to the United States even asked for clemency, citing Mexico's opposition to the death penalty. Just 2 days before her scheduled execution, on April 25, 2022. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay of execution. Melissa would not be put to death, at least not on April 25, 2022. The court ordered the trial court to review new evidence of innocence, and during those subsequent hearings, something else surfaced. The district attorney's office acknowledged that certain exculpatory evidence had not been disclosed to the defense during the original trial. After all was said and done, both the prosecution and the defense ultimately requested that the conviction be overturned. There was just too much doubt surrounding the forensic evidence to sentence this woman to death. It's not like that decision can be reversed. Once someone is executed, you can't go back and change your mind. There's no question that Mariah had been abused, but there was a lot of doubt surrounding what exactly caused her death. Was it an accidental fall, or was it a fatal strike to the head at the hands of her own mother? That's where the controversy around the forensic evidence lies. In April 2024, the trial judge, the same judge who had presided over her original trial, recommended that Melissa be granted a new trial. But that's still not the end of the story. Just 6 months later in October, that same judge went a step further. He found that Melissa is actually innocent and that she did not kill her daughter, and recommended that both her conviction and death sentence be vacated. He essentially agreed with the district attorney that the previous prosecution team suppressed evidence supporting Melissa's defense at trial that Mariah died from an accidental fall. So what happens next? Well, to be honest, nobody knows. As of today, Melissa's case is now before the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which will decide whether to accept Judge Nelson's recommendation that her conviction and death sentence be set aside. So there's still a chance that the state of Texas will follow through on its plan to execute her. There's also a chance she will be given a new trial. There are still so many ways this case can go, and at the heart of it lies the fate of a woman's life. Will Melissa be executed for the sudden death of her 2-year-old daughter? Or will the Court of Appeals lean into the reasonable doubt surrounding her injuries? They also have to answer the biggest question of all. Did a murder even happen? Was Mariah's death a homicide or a tragic accident? Or is there too much gray area to know exactly what happened that day to that poor little girl? In case you want to learn more about Melissa's story, it's been covered extensively on both TV shows and documentaries. In 2020, filmmaker Sabrina Van Tassel released a documentary titled The State of Texas versus Melissa. The film followed Melissa's story in depth, from the night of Mariah's death to the interrogation, to the mounting questions surrounding her conviction. It premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2020 and later won Best Documentary at the Raindance Film Festival. It was this documentary that introduced Melissa's case to a national and international audience. Then in 2022, her case was featured on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. In an episode titled Wrongful Convictions, Melissa's case was highlighted as an example of how procedural barriers, particularly under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, can make it extremely difficult for federal courts to correct potential injustices. Then just weeks later, the show mentioned her case again in an episode about police interrogations. There, it pointed out that Melissa's interrogation contained many of the hallmarks commonly associated with false confessions: prolonged questioning, emotional pressure, repeated accusations, and an exhausted suspect eventually saying what investigators appeared to want to hear. By this point, Melissa's case was no longer just a local capital murder trial. It had become part of a broader national debate about interrogations, trauma, forensic certainty, and the death penalty itself. I know we've talked a lot of numbers and statistics throughout this episode, but here's another one I thought was interesting. Of the 67 women listed on the National Registry of Exonerations who were exonerated after a murder conviction, over 1/4 involved false confessions and nearly 1/3 involved child victims. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, since 1973, 187 people have been exonerated from death row, including 16 in Texas. And the number of people whose lives were taken before they were able to prove their innocence is unknown. At the center of this case is a little girl who lost her life. Mariah Alvarez was 2 years old, and nothing about this story changes that. But the question that remains years later is whether the forensic evidence told the full story. Was Mariah the victim of deadly abuse? Or was her death the result of a tragic accident, interpreted through the lens of bruises, trauma history, and a broken interrogation? The medical examiner called it homicide. Another pathologist later questioned that conclusion. Investigators called 4 words a confession. Experts in trauma called them survival. And in a case that once came within days of an execution, those distinctions matter, because in capital cases, certainty is everything. If you have experienced sexual abuse and want to speak to someone, call the free and confidential National Sexual Assault Hotline 1-800-656-HOPE or 1-800-656-4673. Melissa's legal fight is still unfolding. If you'd like to stay up to date on developments in her case, you can follow the work of the Innocence Project. I'll continue following this case as well. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to support the show and help fund research, production, and editing, you can do so with a small monthly contribution on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive bonus content. You can learn more at patreon.com/Forensic Tales. You can also watch Forensic Tales on YouTube. Just search Forensic Tales Podcast and be sure to subscribe. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a positive rating or review really helps others discover it. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.